Having framed the times and places in which St. Paul lived, it is now time to talk about his youth, his education, up to that event that marked his existence, and that is his encounter with Jesus in Damascus. We will then be able to understand a little better progressively who St. Paul really was. I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, St. Paul says of himself in one of his speeches. The city of Tarsus was situated in a truly strategic location. In addition to the connections it had to the sea via a navigable river, Tarsus was an obligatory passage for all those who had to cross the Taurus mountain range and move from west to east or vice versa. It involved overcoming narrow and difficult valleys, as happened to the 10,000 soldiers of Alexander the Great almost 300 years earlier, headed for the conquest of Persia. And the same happened in 1097 when the army of the First Crusade crossed it, headed for Syria to the conquest of the Holy Land. Paul himself crossed those valleys when, from Antioch, as we shall see, he headed for the cities of Galatia. Some trace of his time spent in Tarsus is found in his letters. For example, in his city, women used to go on the streets and present themselves at celebrations and liturgies with a veil on their heads, which was quite common in those days. The opposite of what happened in other more cosmopolitan and unprejudiced cities such as Corinth. This is why Paul declares, quite annoyed in his first letter to the Corinthians, "If then anyone has a taste for contestation, we have no such custom." Paul was a Pharisee, one of the strictest Jewish sects. It is also conceivable that Paul in his youth helped his father, who was probably a tent maker. Indeed, it was a sound principle of the Pharisees to combine the study of Torah, i.e., Jewish law, with a secular occupation. But what were Jews doing outside of Judea? Indeed, after the death of Alexander the Great and the division of his empire into many kingdoms, Judea had become part of the great empire of the Seleucids, who had imposed a forced Hellenization on their culture. As a consequence, many Jews had decided to move to closer regions where they could find greater tolerance. They had thus formed large communities and were called Hellenistic Jews, a word we will use from now on very often, precisely because they lived in a country of Greek culture. Historians estimate that if there were at that time 1 million Jews, in Judea there were 6 million scattered throughout the rest of the Roman Empire. The ties to the homeland of these Hellenistic Jews remained strong, however, and like almost Jews, they traveled to Jerusalem for solemn feasts, particularly Passover. Each diaspora community had its own synagogue in the Holy City as a landmark. They were places of prayer, preaching, but also lodging for those passing through. Paul had certainly taken advantage of this when he traveled from Tarsus to Jerusalem to complete his studies with Gamaliel, one of the most famous teachers at the time, known for his flexible approach that avoided caging the law. When he returned to Tarsus, Paul, after his studies, he was probably 18 or 20 years old. At that time, he will not have had the opportunity to get to know Jesus because he was still in his hidden period. Well, in this meeting, we talked about Paul's youth and his studies in Jerusalem as a doctor of the law. Paul, having returned to his hometown of Tarsus, had before him many projects, not only because of his position as a notable of the city, but also because he felt, because of his deep faith and doctrinal background, that he could do much for his people. Instead, his life would have developments that Paul, at that time, could not even imagine.